Hello everyone, I would like to introduce you to our long-awaited guest speaker, Mr. Joseph Sullivan. Before we get started, can you tell us what you do for a living? Like, what's your job title, what does that entail?
I'm a biologist and I work for the federal DOT, and I review projects across my particular state, ensuring that they meet the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, and under that National Environmental Policy Act we consider a very wide spectrum of topics, including water quality, endangered species, wetland protections, archaeological and historical artifacts and resources protections, as well as social resources, and ensuring that they are looked at and considered within decision-making processes.
So when somebody wants to build a road, you tell them whether or not they can, based on, if it's going to affect an endangered species, or if it's going to encroach on a space that can't be expanded on.
We at least tell them, hey, you've got to look at all these different topics in your decision-making process.
Oh.
Correct.
So when I approached you about doing this interview, I just pictured us having a conversation, but then you suggested that we take a tour, and you actually take a tour with your interns. This is the same tour that you guys take. Where exactly are we going to be going today?
In Tallahassee, Florida, we've got a project that I bring my interns on that take the process from a project that's already been built to a project that is being built, and a project that has just finished the NEPA process. And we look at those three different phases of the NEPA process, of the federal process, in project development, and we talk about different topics along that way, and then we go to a local park that again emphasizes those topics, including water quality, ecology, the different endangered species in the area. And ours is a specific area. So we kind of, it's a good way to look at a broad spectrum of topics in a very short period of time. So I'm introducing interns, and they've been from across the nation, to a series of topics that we look at in the NEPA process.
Oh, cool. All right. Let me kind of right there. Yeah.
You want to talk about water quality?
Yeah, I figured we were going to do it on the drive.
On the drive?
Yeah. Is that okay?
Well, no, I think we should talk about some basic concepts up front.
Okay.
Some basic concepts are really straightforward.
No, just a second. Alright, so before we get going, you want to talk about some basic concepts behind, water quality, soil-water interaction, that kind of stuff. And what exactly did you want to talk about?
Well, when we talk about water quality, we talk about, when we look at any project, when we talk about water quality, and the science goes a lot deeper, there's a lot more technical involvement here, but we're at a very high level. We talk about water quality and how our projects might impact that water quality. And those same concepts that we look at on a project by project basis can be applied to a homeowner, a resident, individual basis. But the concepts are pretty broad, and if you take them at a simple level, are very understandable. The concept of physics in water quality. So water flows downhill. Everybody knows that. It's a pretty straightforward concept.
Unless it's science fiction, obviously.
Unless it's science fiction, or it's St. John's River, because it flows north. But it's actually downhill, so that's okay. Water flowing downhill applies both at a horizontal method when you look at it in a mapping series, but it specifically applies when you talk about a geological or topological change. So here in our area, we've got certain changes between the coastal area, which obviously runs at zero elevation from mean high water lines, to up to about 130 to 200 vertical feet off of the coastal elevation. So those water bodies that might sit at 120, 130 feet off of the mean high water line have a tendency, because they're at, on a physics aspect, they're at a higher potential energy. They want to flow downstream to the lower potential energy. So they will do that either by flowing down through a stream, flowing over surface water, so over the surface, or they'll flow through geology. So cracks in the subsurface layers that allow it. And here in Florida, when we talk about those cracks in subsurface layers, it's springs. So if we've got a lake at 130 feet, whatever goes into that lake at 130 feet elevation might show up at that spring that's at 20 or 30 feet elevation. So the water quality of going into that lake has a specific impact downstream at that spring that's at a much lower potential energy because of the elevation change.
And that doesn't really get filtered out between the two, like between the lake
and
the spring.
There's a lot of different factors that are involved, but once it's in the water column, it takes a lot to take that stuff back out.
Right.
So the idea of keeping it from getting into the the column in the first place is paramount. Keeping your pollutions, whatever you want to call them, the extra nutrients, the dog poopy, the pesticides or herbicides that you have in your yard, trying to keep them from getting into the lake or the stream that's at an elevation that might eventually lead to a lower elevation, is a main concept of not impacting the people that are downstream from you. When you look at a stream, a river, or a creek, it's very obvious. It's a linear connection to the people downstream from you. But when you look at a lake that might be at a higher potential energy, and then a spring that is a lower elevation, that connection is kind of obscure. But the impact that you have, the water quality, and that you have on that lake specifically shows up in that downstream or that outlet that is a spring in Florida. So that water quality, it's a really easy physics concept that we've all heard. You know, water flows from a high, water flows downstream, but the physics concept, it flows from a high energy potential source to a low potential energy source. So we've got to consider everything that we do upstream affects things that are downstream.
You mentioned like with your, when you take your dog out for a walk and you just kind of leave it there instead of picking it up. It's not just somebody might step in; it's also it gets down into the aquifer, right?
Whatever we do on a normal basis has an effect somewhere. So you think, well, dog feces is not a major nutrient content, but if you go to a park that's a high concentration of dog walking, that water itself that might run off of that park into the adjacent lake, we've got one here in town that comes to mind, that degrades the water quality of the lake, and because the water in the lake is at a higher potential than those areas downstream, now it has an effect to those people miles away, and those even recreational facilities miles away, because we're not picking up on it. In nature, we would have that same fecal contamination, we want to call it that. The poopy is at such a lower concentration that it wouldn't be a problem necessarily. So because we're concentrating it in locations at such a higher grade, we need to try to decrease that or take that out of the concentration. So even picking up your dog stuff when you're walking your dog has an effect. So we want to make sure we do that.
Telling me earlier that vegetation has because plants like the nutrients from certain things like that, and that has an effect on what gets down into the groundwater. Yeah, there's positive effects, and then there's specific indicators that plants can give to us. Mm-hmm. Positive effects. Plants like nutrients. You know, so if we talk about urea, which is P, mm-hmm. with a high concentration of nitrogen, and urea is great for plants, mm-hmm. except that the plants can't pick up all of it. Right. So that same urea that is the plants are loving, mm-hmm. if it gets into the water column, a lake or a pond can also lead to algae blooms and other plant, high quantities of plants that wouldn't necessarily be there naturally. Right. So we want to try to keep those high nitrogen contents and the high phosphorus contents specifically from the water column, if we can. I mean, basically, what we're talking about is trying to keep what would be a normal or natural level at that level, so that the water quality isn't degraded below what would have been a normal or natural level. Right. So just lowering our impact, not really adding more than it can handle, than the nature can handle. Keep it at the natural level is the goal. We're trying to, as intelligent human beings, intelligent animals, trying to interact with the natural resource in a way we would have if there was less concentration of us. We want to act so we don't have a negative impact, and that takes a little thought because there's so many of us, mm-hmm. and it takes, on an individual basis, some intelligent actions on our part. Mm-hmm. You know, and some of those are really simple, mm-hmm. and that's all we're trying to do is make those really simple actions something that we do on a regular basis, and they become habits. Now, one thing that I think I've mentioned this in videos before that I found pretty fascinating, we've talked about it before, is the difference that you see in plant growth, how happy your plants are, so to speak, whenever, like the difference between watering your plants with like purified water versus how grateful they are for rainwater and how much they can sprout up, like how our plants sprouted up after we've been dealing with all this rain because it's hurricane season, and they just sprouted out of nowhere. Why is that exactly? Normal rain and natural rain, mm-hmm. As it falls through the atmosphere, picks up, because water itself is, and this goes to a second basic concept I want to talk about. Water itself, on a chemical level, is called the universal I'm missing the word. Why am I missing the word? It actually adds and it can. It's a natural glue, so to speak. Yeah. Is that what you're going for? That's the idea. It attracts many different things. Mm-hmm. It can hold on to many different chemicals. Is that a hydrogen bond? It's been a while since chemistry. Yeah, hydrogen and oxygen. If you think about oxygen and hydrogen, there's only two hydrogens and there's an oxygen in pure water. Mm-hmm. But as it passes through the atmosphere, it's able to pick up other things that are in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So in some parts of the nation, there is a sulfuric particulates in the atmosphere
And as the rain literally passes through the, and in cloud formations, it passes through and picks up and absorbs the sulfur, then the water itself becomes slightly more acidic, which leads us to acid rain. The same thing here. So as water moves through a column, it will pick up those nitrogens, those phosphorus. So as it falls in through the atmosphere, it can pick up nitrogen. Nitrogen is a major component of the atmosphere. When it picks up the nitrogen in the atmosphere, now rainwater is not just H2O, it's H2O plus some other things that are attached. And because it allows for that attachment, it becomes something that's a lot better for normal waters. Compared to, when you going back to your point, compared to what we consider a purified water, which is non-bacterial, hopefully lower in nitrogen or nutrient content, so that it is good for us to drink.
Right.
Plants like the nutrients, so natural rainwater does act as a boost for plants. When you compare it to something that's coming out of your tap, often what's coming out of your tap has been treated. Those treatments include UV and chlorine and some other treatments to try to kill off the bacteria, so that they don't hurt us. Understandable. When we apply that to plants, the plants themselves will fend better, will grow better, if they have a less treated water. Agriculture as a whole uses direct aquifer or well water. Those well waters are much more purified by natural systems, and they don't necessarily have the chlorines and the UV radiations that might treat our waters. Those well waters are better for the plants themselves.
What exactly is that natural filtration system you're talking about?
The natural filtration system that is very simply, it's a series of layers that goes from the ground we walk on down to the point where the well picks up the water. That natural filtration system is the organics next to the surface of the earth and the biology that's in those organics, and the plant systems that are the roots that pick up some of the waters and use that waters. And layer by layer, at the upper layer, a very, very active layer that includes organics that are in the soil surface. And those organics are high nutrient contents. They are actively filtering nutrients as well as other chemicals out of the water. Where they can be held, they can be washed through, or they can be picked up by plants. Below that layer, you get to a slightly less layer of active filtration, but it may be chemically active depending on the type of soil that it's in. If it's a very heavy or denser soil, clay particulates versus sand particulates. In Florida, we've got a lot of sand. Sand is silicon dioxide, which is very inert.
It's not
by
positive
itself.
or negative, just...
Or it doesn't react chemically with other things. But when you get to the finer particulates, when you talk about the size of the soil itself, we're talking about particle size, sand, silt, and clay. The finer particulates have more active sites to react chemically with things that are coming through it. So those things coming in the water as it filters down through the layers, if you've got a higher density of particles, a clay versus a sand, those clay layers have an opportunity to hold on to what's coming through them in the water. So it has an opportunity to filter out at a better efficiency some of those chemistries, those things that we don't necessarily want to get to our aquifer.
Right. So it's like a natural Brita filter.
It becomes when we talk about, when you compare it to a carbon filter is active because, and even the advertisements say that it's an active carbon filter. You know, an active carbon filter, you could call the soil the same thing. That upper horizons of the soil, because it's got so much carbon in it, so much activity, biological and chemically active sites, that it filters the water very well. In Florida, we've got a lot of areas in Florida that don't have a very thick active filter horizon, so we've got other water quality problems than we might have in other states, where we've got a thicker clay layer or a finer particulate in the upper soil stratums that can actively filter those things. So when I talk about filter, the natural filter, I'm talking about the soil column itself. The soil column, the particle size within that soil column, and how that particle size and the organics involved and the plant interactions within that column, how they're able to pick up particulates or chemistry that's involved in the water quality.
What advice would you give somebody who wants to collect rainwater for drinking water? Like somebody who's like, I don't want to pay for my water, I just want to collect the rainwater that comes down and then use that for my drinking water.
For drinking water? I'm not sure if I'd want to give somebody who wants to drink the water.
Is there something they can do?
I would take a couple of things into consideration. Where is the water coming from? What surface is it coming from?
You wouldn't want to have it run off your roof because you're taking a lot of things with it.
I don't necessarily want it to come off my tar-based roof.
Right, where birds like to sit.
And the birds and all that stuff.
And
a metal roof might be different. If they wanted to collect it for irrigation for their plants, that's something that's verifiable. I love the idea of rain barrels themselves, because they take the water that might otherwise just
kind of
disperse, and then you can utilize it for some other reasons. For drinking water itself, I'm not sure if I would say that if you're going to drink water that you've collected, make sure it's run through a specific filter that guarantees the water quality coming out of it.
Right.
I wouldn't put it in a 55-gallon bucket and then drink out of it.
Right, yeah.
I would maybe collect it in a 55-gallon bucket and then filter it and then be able to drink it.
Right.
But the collection of water that's coming off of our roofs, off of our driveways, off of our sheds, that water that would otherwise just superficially flow, it would have permeated through the soil, which is that active filter we talked about. But now it's just going to superficially flow because there's too much for the soil to actually to allow to filter down through. So a lot of it superficially flows. If you don't catch that water and do something with it, whatever's in that water now is probably going to a creek, a stream, potentially a wetland. In a lot of cases, closed basin wetlands are an awesome filter that will help that. In many cases, because we're so tied to streams, and in the past our concept of dealing with water was, as long as it's not here and I can get it to go downstream,
right,
it's dealt with. We've taken a much broader perspective now to where we try to treat project by project, area by area, the water that's coming off of our impervious surfaces.
Right.
So if there's a store going in, the first thing that they have to do is they actually have to talk about the water that drains from their impervious surfaces and how they're going to treat them. Impervious surface is simply this: the water can't go into the ground surface. The water can't be filtered by natural systems. So what are you going to do with that water that would otherwise go through a natural system, a natural filtration system? Well, and a lot of the permitting that goes on today with various agencies, that's a primary concern. And it goes right back to the idea that water flows downhill, and that basic physics idea. We're going to treat the water that comes off of our impervious surface and be responsible for that, so that when it does flow downhill, either geologically or by creek, stream, or whatever the other system, it doesn't affect the people downstream.
Right.
It's a good point to consider when you're doing that, even at your house. How is your roof? How's the water coming off of your roof? Where's it going? Is it going straight into a swale at the edge of the road? Or are you doing a little bit of something even at your own property to be responsible for that water and the water quality it has? And it goes right back to the personal responsibility, right down to doggy poopy at the park, having the extra nutrients that might flow into those creeks and systems. A lot of the indicators that I've seen across the years that I've been doing this in a high nutrient system are pretty obvious. When you go to a stream, a creek, a lake, a pond, there's often certain plant species that are very indicative of high nutrient systems. Algae blooms, very indicative of high nutrient systems. And we can do something about that. We can, on a personal level, one-on-one level, we can try to make sure that our effect is as minimal as possible.
And how do we do that exactly? Like, if you, like, top three, what are the first 3 things that you could change in your house, you yourself could do?
Collect rainwater if you can.
Okay.
Utilize it where you can in your own agricultural. That's positive in 2 different aspects. Your gardens will do better because it's got the natural chemistry versus the chemistry from your tap water. Try to treat whatever rainwater or surface water coming off of your impervious surfaces. Treating it is very simply in a lot of cases. If there's a way that it flows, capture it and slow it down.
Like, we've actually talked about this before, where it runs off your roof. If it's coming down at that speed and you don't have anything to filter it through, it's just going to go directly in without any filtration into the groundwater. And you're saying, like, lay down stones, right?
Yeah, in a lot of things, if you think about raindrops as raindrops, in a rainstorm you can have several thousand raindrops per square foot. That's a lot of energy in the ground. So in order to dissipate some of that energy, have a lot of vegetation. That dissipates the energy and allows for filtration. It's also coarse, but it also allows for the natural uptake by plants of nutrients that are present in the rainwater. Because it's running off of your roof sometimes, you can also take that same water, that same square footage of that might just be sand and open soil, and allow that to have vegetation. By doing that, you're increasing the nutrient uptake. Not only that, but you're also increasing the particulate or a pesticide or even potential oil distillates that might come off your roof from infiltrating further than just the soil. The plants, actually, the organic content in that layer may help pick up some of that stuff. So first, I would say try to catch your own water. Utilize it where you can. Try to catch your own water so it decreases the energy, so you're allowing for some of that energy to be dissipated because of your actions. So gutters into rain barrels dissipates the energy. Even out of the rain barrels, just let it. The energy is dissipated because you've slowed it down to now it has to flow out of the sides of the rain barrel, flow out onto some rock underneath. But it changes the energy flow of the water. Okay. On a personal level, be aware of your impact nutrient-wise. On I always like to use the analogy when I'm teaching my folks, the analogy of a grain of salt. We all apply a grain of salt to water quality. At some point, that water quality is going to be a point where we can't use it anymore. If you look at it like a cup of water, and I know that the quantity and the scale is much larger than that, but if you apply a grain of salt to a cup of water, over time, eventually, you are not going to be able to utilize that cup of water for what it was intended, which is water. It's going to be too salty, your body can't deal with it. So if you take that in reverse, every little grain of salt, or in this case nutrients or chemicals that we can keep from getting into that cup of water, helps that from going to a useless state, extends the usefulness of that cup of water for a much longer period of time. So on a personal basis, whatever you can do to decrease the nutrient quantity input, including your washing your car over the grass instead of over the concrete, so that your water itself goes into the soil column and is filtered. Any oil distillates or antifreeze, other things that you might have picked up from the roadway, goes into the soil column and gets filtered. Other than that, I think really just being aware of your surroundings and what your effect is on that water column might be. It's pretty simple on a day-to-day basis. Some of those things are very simple. Mulching, not trying to put stuff into the dump, because all you're doing is concentrating the impact at one location instead of dissipating it over a much larger location. A lot of topics we could get into, but I think they're a lot further than what we're talking about here.